Hello again as we continue our video series for BA310 Ethics in the Workplace. In this video we're going to go over Chapter 5, which is labeled Corporations. And really the first question in Chapter 5 is, what is this idea of limited liability and what does it mean? And what limited liability really means is it limits the liability or how much you can lose if you get sued or whatever happens, how much you can lose, how much the owners can lose if the company goes out of business or gets sued. And really what limited liability means is that you can only lose up to what you put into the company. So for most corporations, the owners of the corporation are what we call stockholders. And what it means is that you can only lose how much you put into the company, that you can't be sued yourself for the actions of the corporation. The corporation can go out of business, file bankruptcy, which would mean that the stock price would go from whatever it is today down to zero, and you would lose everything that you put into the company, but you couldn't be sued for your assets outside of the corporation. So there's two other types of corporations or companies that we'll talk about. And the first is a sole proprietor. And probably the easiest thing to think about with a sole proprietor is somebody who owns a business and, in downtown area, wherever you happen to live. And as far as liability goes, that a sole proprietor has 100% liability for that corporation, which really means that you can sue that company as well as that individual for pretty much everything that they own, other than our bankruptcy laws say that you can't sue somebody where they lose their primary residence. But other than that, they have what we might consider unlimited liability. And then there's partnerships, and partnerships can be large companies or small with just two people, but they can also be quite large with 20, 30, 40, 50 different partners. And the interesting thing about a partnership is that each partner has unlimited liability, which really means that somebody could go after just one partner. If you have one rich person, let's say, that somebody could go after that one person for all the debts of the partnership. So it isn't like, oh, well, I only own 5% of the business, therefore I'm only responsible for 5% of the debts. You are actually, even though you're only a 5% owner, if you're the one that has the money and you're the one that people can go after, you are 100% liable for all the liabilities in that corporation. Now, I will say that there are legal protections for both sole proprietors and partnerships, and in many cases next to businesses you'll see the words LLP or LLC next to it, and that really just means like a limited liability partnership, which they filed the paperwork in the court so that they have limited liability just like a corporation does. So the next question, which probably goes better in a class where we can discuss it, but the question that the chapter kind of highlights and brings up is, should corporations be held responsible or fined for the acts of their employees? And I think maybe the easy answer is yes, they should. But I think if we look into it a little bit different or a little bit closer, should they? If one employee out of 70,000 does something wrong, should that person, which I don't think anybody has any question that, for example, I should be held liable for my actions. The real question is, should, in this example, since I'm an employee of Limestone, should Limestone be held liable for my actions? And should they be fined or sued for the actions of one of their employees? And I think this, if we really think about it, it becomes a much more difficult question, because if the company or the corporation is sued, who's harmed? And you could argue in this case that perhaps the students are harmed other employees are harmed, yes, I am harmed because, and I did the wrong, so I don't think anybody's got a problem with that. But again, I should be held liable for my actions. The real question is should the company or corporation be held liable for my actions? Additionally, for all of us that are employees out there, it also, because I think everybody's initial answer is yes, that they should be because, well, the company hired me, Limestone hired me, and therefore they should be held liable. The company's responsible for doing background checks. But again, if I do something out of the norm, yes, they've done a background check on me, but a background check only checks if I have prior history of felonies or whatever it may be. It doesn't really say what's going to happen in the future. So yes, companies do background checks. Yes, companies do drug testing and all that kind of stuff. But what about the things that are going to happen in the future? And I think, again, we all sit there and say, yes, they should be held liable. And that's our initial gut reaction. But what that leads to corporations is more of a one strike and you're out policy as well, right? That anything you do wrong, they know if they get sued, all of our initial reaction is they should be held liable for your actions. And therefore, companies, I think, are more apt to fire employees because of that. Because now it's even worse that if they had done anything in the past, oh, he yelled at an employee, well, let's fire him, because if somebody sues 5 years from now for a hostile work environment and it's on record that we counseled this person for yelling, well, certainly then we're going to say that the corporation should be held liable because they knew this person was a hothead. I mean, that's going to be how it's portrayed. So I do think there's some negative to all of our kind of initial reaction to should corporations or companies be held liable for the acts of their employees. Obviously, it's a different case when the entire company or you've got 50 of the C-level executives and they're all getting together to commit fraud. That might be a little bit different case, but what we're really talking about is one employee does something, I do something wrong in the classroom, should Limestone be held liable for those? And I think it's a little bit tougher question. So the third thing that the chapter kind of highlights is different views of corporate social responsibility. And the first one, which is interesting, which probably is one that many companies follow, is this idea of profit maximization. And Milton Friedman said that corporations have no responsibility other than to follow the law and to seek profit. And I think that's probably our view of many corporations. And perhaps that's a jaded view of corporations, because it doesn't mean that corporations won't do something that is socially responsible. It really means that corporations will only do something that is socially responsible if they see a profit out of it. So would I do something that is socially responsible? Really the answer is only if the people are willing to pay for it. So if my customers are willing to pay for it and pay more for it, and I can increase profit by doing something, then I will. So under this view, again, it's not that corporations won't do something that's socially responsible. Really, it's up to us as the consumer to demand something that's socially responsible, and then the corporation would react to it under this idea of profit maximization. Now, the second one that the chapter highlights, they call the broad view, which really means that, going back to chapter 1, that a corporation should be taking all constituents or all stakeholders into account when deciding to do something that is socially responsible. And again, this sounds really great that corporations should be doing this, but one of the things that I always highlight in class is, in many cases, doesn't that come down to profit anyway? So would, for example, would Walmart increase its customer service if they didn't think that anybody would shop there anymore? Well, of course the answer is no, because it's going to increase costs with no offsetting revenue to the side. But if they thought that hiring 50 more people per store would double profit, would they do it? And I think the answer to that is yes. Would a company give employees a raise? Again, if they think, under profit maximization, if they think that that raise will increase profitability, then yes. And if not, they probably won't do it. So again, while it sounds good that they're taking, the community into effect, the customer into effect, the employees all together, it may still come down to that view of profit maximization. And the last one that they highlight is the let the government do it, which has its own problems. Is our government or any government really, the greatest as far as social responsibility? Second, usually laws with the government follow somebody doing something wrong. And it's similar to most corporations that, every corporation has a list of policies and a policy manual that's anywhere from an inch thick to 5 inches thick, depending on the corporation. But generally, that is changed when somebody figured out either something different that isn't covered in the policy manual, or figured out some way around the policy that, while it wasn't the intent of the policy, they're figuring out some way to get around the policy, and then we've got to change the policy. And the same thing's true with laws, that Sarbanes-Oxley came about because of Enron and WorldCom cooking the books, and then we have a law afterwards. So I don't know that the let the government do it is the best option, not that they can't follow up at the end, similar to company policies. Now, company policies probably are enacted much faster than a law, but still it follows the unethical behavior that potentially isn't against the law or isn't against the policy. And the last thing in this chapter is, do corporations have the right to free speech? And this was an interesting question during the Obama administration in the United States. And what came about was, the real question was, do corporations have the right to give to political campaigns? I think we can all agree that individuals have the right to give. And part of that right is in the First Amendment, the right to free speech. And part of your free speech is what you do with your money. And really, that's how we as individuals can give to political campaigns. Whether it was, on one side, the D side, or the R side, or an I side, we have that right based on free speech. And really the question was, and the case was the Bellotti decision highlighted in the textbook, but do corporations have that same free speech right to give to campaigns? And the government at the time was arguing no, that they shouldn't. That really, while the people in that corporation have the free speech right, the corporation itself doesn't have free speech rights, because it doesn't necessarily represent the people within that corporation. And I would say that that's true, that likely, no matter who you give to on a political side, my guess is most corporations, especially large corporations, represent the population of the United States, where you have a large minority of people that are going to vote R, no matter who's running, and you have a large minority of the population that's going to vote for a D, no matter who's running, and then you have this other population that kind of swings either way, depending on who's running. But But there's a large population that no matter who's running is going to support the letter R or the letter D. So really, I mean, it is a good point that any corporation, if it's even close to representing the people in the United States, is going to have a large portion of people that disagree with whoever the corporation gives to. However, I would say that most corporations give to their own benefit. So if a politician was for renewable energy, my guess is that a corporation that would benefit from increased renewable energy would give to that campaign. Whether the person has a D or an R next to their name, they would give to that campaign. So, really, most corporations base it on that Milton Friedman model where we're seeking a profit maximization no matter what. So they're going to give to a politician that they think will vote according to what benefits that corporation. Anyway, the Supreme Court, it went to the Supreme Court, and it was a 5-4 decision that corporations do have this free speech right. And one of the questions in there was, if a corporation, which is a tough thing because what is a corporation? It's a made up thing, right? Like nobody is X corporation. But if we don't allow them free speech rights, what other rights doesn't a corporation have under the US Constitution? Do they not have the right to unreasonable search and seizure? So the government can go in and raid and search without a search warrant? Do they not have that right, a corporation, because it's a made up thing? So really the Supreme Court found that corporations do have free speech rights and every other right in the Constitution. And that really ends up the focus, the 4 main things within Chapter 5, the limited liability, the question about, which is really a question on corporations being held liable and responsible for the acts of their employees, the social responsibility, and the Bellotti decision as far as free speech rights for corporations.